Every blockbuster drug has an expiration date. The patents eventually run out. Competitors arrive. Billions of dollars in revenue can disappear, sometimes faster than investors expect. And Johnson & Johnson has already faced this challenge. But here is what makes J&J different. This is not simply a pharmaceutical company built around one or two successful drugs. It is a healthcare platform with more than $90 billion in annual sales, operating across two powerful engines, Innovative Medicine and MedTech. One engine creates new therapies. The other builds the technologies that hospitals and physicians use to deliver care. So the real question is not whether Johnson & Johnson will eventually lose its blockbusters. It will. The real question is whether J&J can consistently build what comes next. Because the future of this healthcare giant will not be determined by whether its biggest drugs last forever. It will be determined by whether the company can outlive them. For decades, Johnson & Johnson was one of the most recognizable consumer healthcare companies in the world. But that is no longer the company investors are analyzing today. After separating its consumer health business, J&J became a more focused healthcare company built around two businesses, Innovative Medicine and MedTech. That transformation is important. Because the investment thesis is no longer based on familiar household products. It is now based on whether J&J can repeatedly create new medicines, develop new medical technologies, and replace products that eventually lose their competitive protection. In other words, Johnson & Johnson has become a more focused company. But also a company where innovation matters more than ever. Today, Johnson & Johnson is powered by two very different businesses. The first is Innovative Medicine. This is where J&J develops therapies in areas such as oncology, immunology, and neuroscience. The second is MedTech. Here, the company develops technologies used in surgery, cardiovascular care, and other medical procedures. These businesses operate differently. One is driven primarily by intellectual property and clinical innovation. The other is driven by technology, procedures, and healthcare infrastructure. Together, they create something important. J&J is no longer dependent on a single product, or even a single type of healthcare business. But diversification alone is not enough. The real question is whether both engines can continue growing as older products inevitably reach the end of their life cycle. Johnson & Johnson now operates at a scale few healthcare companies can match. The company generated approximately $94 billion in sales in 2025. But the headline number is not the most important part. What matters is where that revenue comes from. Innovative Medicine contributed the majority, generating more than $60 billion in sales. MedTech contributed another $34 billion. Together, these businesses give J&J exposure to two of the most important forces in healthcare, the demand for new treatments and the demand for better medical technology. But scale also creates a challenge. A company this large cannot rely on simply maintaining the status quo. To continue growing, J&J must constantly replace what eventually disappears. The biggest threat to a blockbuster drug is not always a better competitor. Sometimes, it is simply time. Every major pharmaceutical product eventually faces the same problem. Patents expire. And when exclusivity disappears, competition can enter the market and pressure billions of dollars in revenue. Johnson & Johnson is already experiencing this cycle. Stelara became one of the company's most important products. But as biosimilar competition began to emerge, the economics of the drug started to change. This is the reality of pharmaceutical innovation. The same products that create billions in revenue today will eventually need to be replaced. And that is why the most important question for J&J is not how successful its biggest drugs are right now. It is whether the company has already built what comes next. The future of Johnson & Johnson depends on one ability above all others: replacing what eventually disappears. Today, the company is building its next generation of growth around several major platforms. In oncology, products such as Darzalex and Carvykti are expanding J&J's presence in some of the most important areas of cancer treatment. In immunology, Tremfya is becoming an increasingly important growth driver. And in neuroscience, Spravato gives the company exposure to a market where significant unmet medical needs still exist. The important point is that J&J is not simply looking for one replacement for one blockbuster. It is building a portfolio of growth platforms. Because in pharmaceuticals, the strongest companies do not avoid product cycles. They survive them by continuously creating the next cycle. Innovative medicine is the center of Johnson & Johnson's long-term growth story. In 2025, the segment generated more than $60 billion in sales. But its importance goes beyond its current revenue. This is where J&J attempts to create the products that will define its next decade. The company is focused on areas such as oncology, immunology, neuroscience, and other therapeutic categories where the potential market remains significant. But pharmaceutical innovation is a difficult business. For every successful product, there are clinical trials that fail, regulatory approvals that never arrive, and promising ideas that never become commercial products. That is why the real advantage of J&J is not any single drug. It is the scale of the system behind the drugs. The research, the clinical infrastructure, the regulatory expertise, and the capital required to keep searching for the next breakthrough. If innovative medicine is built around discovering new treatments, MedTech is built around how healthcare is delivered. Johnson & Johnson's MedTech business generated approximately $34 billion in sales in 2025. The segment operates across areas such as cardiovascular care, surgery, electrophysiology, and other medical procedures. And this creates an important difference. A pharmaceutical product is typically dependent on a specific molecule and its intellectual property protection. A medical device can become part of a much broader clinical ecosystem. It can be integrated into procedures, used by physicians, adopted by hospitals, and improved through successive generations of technology. That does not make MedTech risk-free. But it gives J&J a second path to growth beyond the pharmaceutical patent cycle. And this second engine may become increasingly important as the company's largest medicines mature. Johnson & Johnson does not rely entirely on internal research to build its future. The company also uses acquisitions. The strategy is straightforward. Find technologies, platforms, or businesses that can strengthen areas where J&J wants to grow. In MedTech, acquisitions such as Shockwave expanded the company's position in cardiovascular technology. And in innovative medicine, acquisitions can provide access to new scientific platforms and potential future therapies. But acquisitions are not automatically value-creating. The price matters. The technology must work. The products must eventually reach the market. And management must integrate the acquired business successfully. So the important question is not whether J&J can afford to buy growth. It can. The real question is whether the company can consistently turn acquisitions into profitable, long-term platforms. The future of a pharmaceutical company is often being built years before the revenue appears. In 2025, Johnson & Johnson invested billions of dollars in research and development across innovative medicine and MedTech. That investment may not immediately show up in quarterly earnings, but it determines what the company's revenue could look like 5 or 10 years from now. This is the economic reality of healthcare innovation. A successful drug can generate billions in revenue, but it may take years of research and clinical development before that drug ever reaches the market. And many potential products never make it that far. So J&J's R&D spending should not simply be viewed as an expense. It is the company's investment in replacing the products that will eventually disappear. And the quality of that pipeline may ultimately matter more than the size of today's blockbuster portfolio. Johnson & Johnson does not have a moat built around a single product. Its competitive advantage is more complicated than that. It is built from multiple layers: intellectual property, clinical data, regulatory expertise, global manufacturing, distribution, and decades of relationships across the healthcare system. In pharmaceuticals, successful products can be protected by patents and supported by extensive clinical evidence. In MedTech, products can become embedded in clinical procedures and hospital workflows. But there is an important distinction. None of these advantages are permanent. Patents expire. Technology evolves. And competitors continue to innovate. So J&J's moat must constantly be renewed. And that may be the most important competitive advantage of all. The ability to continuously build the next one. Scale gives Johnson & Johnson advantages that smaller healthcare companies cannot easily replicate. The company can invest billions in research, run global clinical trials, build manufacturing capacity, and commercialize products across markets around the world. But scale also creates a potential weakness. Large organizations can become slower, more complex, and less efficient. That is why portfolio focus matters. J&J is concentrating its resources around major healthcare opportunities, including oncology, immunology, neuroscience, cardiovascular care, surgery, and vision. The goal is not simply to become larger. It is to direct capital toward areas where the company believes it can create the greatest long-term advantage. Because in healthcare, size creates opportunity. But disciplined execution determines whether that opportunity becomes value. The strategy sounds compelling. But ultimately, the financial statements have to confirm the story. In 2025, Johnson & Johnson generated approximately $94 billion in sales. Both major segments contributed to growth. Innovative medicine remained the company's largest business, while MedTech continued to expand its contribution to the overall platform. But revenue growth alone does not tell the complete story. The quality of growth matters. Investors need to understand what is driving it. Is growth coming from new products, acquisitions, pricing, or simply favorable comparisons? And more importantly, can that growth continue after the company's largest products begin to mature? That is where the financial analysis becomes more important than the headline numbers. Because the future value of J&J will depend on the durability of its earnings, not simply the size of its revenue today. A mature healthcare company eventually faces a capital allocation decision. Where should the cash go? Back into research and development. Into acquisitions. Into expanding the business. Toward reducing debt. Or back to shareholders through dividends and share repurchases. Johnson & Johnson has historically returned significant capital to shareholders, while continuing to invest heavily in innovation and acquisitions. That balance is important. Because returning too much capital today could weaken tomorrow's growth. But investing too aggressively in uncertain opportunities can also destroy value. The real test is whether management can balance both. Funding the next generation of medicines and technologies, while continuing to return capital to shareholders. For J&J, capital allocation is not simply a financial decision. It is a decision about the future growth rate of the entire company. Every analysis of Johnson & Johnson must address a risk that cannot be ignored. Litigation. The company has faced significant legal challenges, particularly related to talc litigation. And unlike a patent expiration, litigation is difficult to forecast with precision. The financial impact can depend on court decisions, settlements, appeals, and future legal developments. This creates an important distinction for investors. The underlying businesses can continue to perform well. Innovative medicine can continue launching new products. MedTech can continue growing. And yet, legal liabilities can still create uncertainty around the value of the company. That does not automatically invalidate the business model. But it does mean that legal risk must be treated as a permanent part of the investment analysis. Because a strong operating business does not eliminate every risk attached to the corporate structure. The most important risk facing Johnson & Johnson is also the most fundamental. Innovation can fail. A clinical trial can produce disappointing results. A promising therapy may never receive regulatory approval. A competitor may develop a better treatment. And eventually, even successful products lose exclusivity. This is why the pharmaceutical pipeline matters so much. J&J has several important growth platforms across oncology, immunology, neuroscience, and other therapeutic areas. But a pipeline is not the same as revenue. Potential is not the same as commercial success. And no company can guarantee that its next blockbuster will become as successful as the last one. So the real test is not whether every product succeeds. That is impossible. The test is whether J&J's portfolio is broad and productive enough to absorb failures, and still replace what eventually disappears. MedTech provides Johnson & Johnson with diversification beyond pharmaceuticals. But diversification does not eliminate competition. Medical technology evolves constantly. New procedures can replace existing ones. Hospitals face increasing pressure to control costs. Reimbursement systems can change. And competitors are constantly developing new technologies. This means MedTech should not simply be treated as a defensive business. Its long-term value depends on continued innovation. The strongest medical technology companies do not simply sell devices. They create products that improve clinical outcomes, become part of physician workflows, and eventually become difficult to replace. That is the opportunity for J&J. But it is also the challenge. Because in healthcare, today's technology can eventually become tomorrow's legacy product. The future of Johnson & Johnson will be defined by a race. On one side, the company has products that are already generating billions of dollars in revenue. But these products will eventually mature. On the other side, J&J is investing in new medicines, new technologies, and new platforms designed to replace them. This creates the central forecasting challenge. How quickly will the existing portfolio decline? How fast can new products grow? And can MedTech provide enough additional growth to reduce the pressure on the pharmaceutical cycle? The answer will determine the future trajectory of the entire company. Because J&J does not need every new product to become the next Stelara. But it does need the combined growth of its next generation of products to be larger than the revenue it eventually loses. After analyzing the business, the growth engines, the competitive advantages, and the risks, we can finally approach valuation. But valuing Johnson & Johnson requires more than applying a simple multiple to today's earnings. The company is going through a transition. Some major products are maturing. New products are expanding. MedTech is becoming increasingly important. And legal uncertainty remains part of the equation. So the valuation must focus on the future earning power of the business. Not simply on what J&J earned in the past. The key question is straightforward. What level of revenue growth can the company sustain? What margins can the business generate? How much free cash flow can it produce? And how much of that future is already reflected in the current share price? After analyzing the business, its growth engines, competitive advantages, and risks, we can now translate our assumptions into a range of potential values. The conservative case produces an estimated value of approximately $185 per share. My fair value estimate is approximately $207 per share. And under a more optimistic scenario, the estimated value reaches approximately $260 per share. These are not price targets or predictions. They represent different potential outcomes based on different assumptions about J&J's future growth and profitability. The market price will continue to move as expectations change. So the purpose of this valuation is not to predict where the stock will trade next. It is to provide a framework for understanding what Johnson & Johnson could be worth under different possible futures. And the central question remains: can J&J continue creating enough new growth to replace what eventually disappears? Johnson & Johnson is no longer simply a company built around familiar healthcare brands. It has become a focused healthcare platform built around two different engines, Innovative Medicine and MedTech. Its strength comes from scale, research capabilities, intellectual property, and the ability to continuously invest in the next generation of products. But the company also faces real challenges. Patents expire. Clinical development is uncertain. Technology evolves. And legal risks remain part of the equation. So the long-term story is not about whether J&J can protect every blockbuster forever. It cannot. The real question is whether the company can consistently create enough new growth to replace what eventually disappears. That is the test of Johnson & Johnson's next decade. The most important lesson from Johnson & Johnson is that even the strongest healthcare companies must constantly reinvent themselves. Products have life cycles. Patents expire. Technologies become outdated. And market expectations change. But a company with the scale, capital, and capabilities to build the next generation of growth can continue evolving. That is what makes Johnson & Johnson worth studying. Not because the future is certain, but because the company has spent decades building a system designed to survive uncertainty. And ultimately, the future of J&J will depend on one question. Can this healthcare giant continue to outlive its blockbusters? As always, this video is not financial advice. Please do your own research before making any investment decisions. Thank you for watching. If you found this analysis helpful, don't forget to like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next equity research.